Suspense? What's suspense? Now, before you begin to react violently, let me dispense my understanding of suspense to you. That is, React Suspense. React Suspense is part of a set of experimental features under the big umbrella of concurrent mode in React. Now, these are experimental features, so I don't want you to be using these in production applications. I just wanted to illustrate to you some features, and hopefully all these would become part of the React 17 version that will come in the future. So what exactly is concurrent mode? Concurrent mode is a set of new features that will help React applications to stay responsive and gracefully adjust to the user's device capabilities and network speed. So that is their definition of what concurrent mode is supposed to be. Now, as part of concurrent mode, suspense for data fetching has been introduced, and which is what we will talk about in this video. So this describes a new mechanism for fetching data in React components. Suspense is itself not a data fetching mechanism, as we will talk about a little bit later. Talking specifically about suspense for data fetching, as we note, this is an experimental feature, but it is actually included from React 16.6 onwards, so you could use some of its features in React applications as of now. Now, what suspense allows you to do is it provides a component that lets you wait for some code to load and declaratively allow you to specify a loading state. Like, for example, if you want to display a spinner to indicate that something is going on behind the scenes, while we are waiting for it to be completed, you can display a loading state. Now, this is very useful, especially in situations where you're fetching data from a server where you're unsure how long it is going to take for you to be able to obtain the data before you update the user interface. So typically these days when we implement React applications, we would use some kind of a loading state that we will maintain in our application, which allows us to display a particular user interface, typically a spinner on the screen, until the point we obtain the data, when we will set the data required for the particular page. Then we will update the UI with the data once it is obtained. Now, before we understand how this works, let me illustrate to you with an example of how we can make use of suspense. To help us understand suspense, let's clone a Git repository where I have implemented an application making use of suspense. So let's go to github.com, jmupala, react suspense.git. And once the repository is cloned, let's move to the React Suspense folder. And then you will see that this already contains application. Let's go ahead and do a yarn install to install all the packages. And once the installation is complete, let's check out the Git commits in this repository. So you see that we have several Git commits there. I'm going to check out the suspense 1 Git commit and then start explaining to you from that point onwards. So let's check out the suspense 1 commit. So let me go ahead and check out that. And then we will open this in a editor, a VS Code in this case. Also, at the same time, let's launch the application by typing yarn start at the command line. And once the application is launched, let's go to a browser and then open the React application in the browser. You will notice on the screen a spinner first, and then after that, you see this on the screen. So here is a list of users. Let's click on a user, and you will notice immediately that it starts loading, and then it loads information about a set of albums for that user. And when you click on a specific album for that user, again, you notice that upon completion, it's going to load a set of photos on the screen. And anytime you switch to another user, you will notice that you're going to be again shown the new set of albums for the selected user is displayed here. And I'm going to click on one of the albums for this user, and that set of photos for that user is going to be displayed on the screen there. So this is your typical application. And you noticed how when we click to load any information on the screen, then the loading spinner is displayed on the screen, the entire screen disappears, and then after the data is loaded, then the user interface is shown on the screen here. You don't need to worry too much about the application itself, but the intention of this application is to illustrate to you how Suspense works. Going to the source code of our application, in the application itself, if I open app.js, in app.js, you will notice that in the code, I have declared a suspense component here in the app function here. And this suspense component is taking a parameter called fallback here. This attribute fallback is specifying the loading component with a message here. And you see that this is exactly what was being displayed on the screen when the data was being loaded in our application. And within this application, you will notice that I am displaying three different components here. The user list, which displays the list of users on the screen, the album list, which displays the list of albums for a selected user, and then the set of photos which are from the selected album for that particular user. Now, exactly how these components are implemented is immaterial to us, because what we are interested in is the fact that we are making use of the suspense component here and taking advantage of the suspense component in order to display the loading screen when the data is being fetched. Now, if you are curious, you can go into the components, and let me go into the user list.js file here. This component implements, as you would expect, a grid list here, which shows a list of the users there. Now, this is going to be fetching data from a server here. The server itself, you will notice, is at this particular location. This is a public server from which you can fetch some data in order to display the data on the screen. And I'm just making use of that to illustrate to you. And then here in the data operations.js file, you will notice that we have the fetch from that server implemented here. Now, within the user list itself, you see that there is no place where we are actually tracking the loading state itself, but instead we are calling something called the use query. Now, I'm going to talk to you more about this in a short while. The entire display of the waiting state is through this suspense component with the loading component supplied as a fallback here. Now, if you are wondering what exactly is suspense and how does it actually work, if you look at the documentation, it says, as we mentioned earlier, the suspense lets your components wait for something before they can render. So that's the idea behind suspense. And the suspense takes a fallback component as an attribute here, the fallback component is what is going to be displayed while we are waiting for something to be available before you can render the components that are inside this suspense. Now, in the documentation also, you can see an example of how we make use of suspense, but suspense itself is not a data fetching operation. It doesn't do the data fetching itself. It expects you to provide the appropriate library for implementing the data fetching. But what suspense allows you to do is it allows the data fetching libraries to deeply integrate with React. So you expect certain amount of support from a data fetching library, which will supply the appropriate loading conditions for suspense to be able to react appropriately and display the fallback component. So the loading state information is something that is up to your data fetching library to be able to provide that for you. Now, right now, suspense support has been implemented as part of the relay integration, which Facebook uses for their Facebook application. Now, relay is used to fetch from GraphQL endpoints. Now, in the example that I've illustrated, I am using a different library called as React Query, which also provides suspense integration. So there are not a whole lot of data libraries that are currently available that provide the suspense integration that is required in order to take advantage of the features provided by suspense. So that's why I said it's an experimental feature, but hopefully when it is finally released as part of React 17, then we would have a lot more data fetching libraries that will support what suspense allows you to do. Now, in this case, I am making use of a library called as React Query. Now, React Query is a powerful data synchronization library that is available for you that you can use together with React in order to manage your data needs. Now, I'm going to talk about React Query in a separate video where I will explain exactly how I implemented the components that I just illustrated to you in the example earlier, and how we actually make use of the React Query library for the data fetching purpose, and also how it allows us to integrate with suspense. One issue, let me again reload my application. Now, one issue that you noticed in this application is that whenever any of the internal components, so for example, even if I am loading a set of albums for a selected user, the entire screen disappears with the loading being shown there, or even if I am loading a set of photos, the entire screen disappears with the loading on the screen. Now, if you don't want this behavior, then you can use suspense boundaries around each of the components. Now, going back to the code, you will notice that in this code, the suspense is surrounding all these three components here. So if any of these components are fetching data for rendering the details in that component, then the corresponding suspense boundary that is implemented by the suspense takes over and then displays the fallback screen, which is the spinner with the loading message there. Now, if, for example, you wanted to limit it to specific component itself that which when it is fetching data doesn't end up hiding the remaining components, then we can reduce the suspense boundary around these components. So instead of having a single suspense that surrounds all these components, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this suspense and then surround each one of these components with their own suspense boundary here. So here I am taking the original suspense here and then surrounding each of these components in their own suspense boundaries here. And then, of course, we need to close off the suspense boundaries here. So here we have the first suspense boundary here, which I am going to use, and then the second suspense boundary here, which encloses the second component, the album list component here. And then also, so what I've done is I have defined suspense boundaries around each of these components. And also let me change the message here. So for the first suspense boundary here, so we'll say loading users. The second suspense boundary will say loading albums. And the third suspense boundary will say loading photos here as the corresponding message. So here you notice that I am surrounding the photo list component with its own suspense boundary. Then I am surrounding the album list component with its own suspense boundary. And then of course the user list component has its own suspense boundary, each of them inside the other there. So with this change, let's save the changes and then go and take a look at the updated application in the browser. Going to the browser, you notice that first the users get loaded. Let me select one of the users. So if I select a user, you notice that instead of the entire screen disappearing, the user list is still there, but the set of albums is being loaded here. And now if I select a specific album here, you notice that the album list doesn't disappear. Instead, the photos are themselves being loaded, and you see the loading spinner for the photos being displayed here. So by defining suspense boundaries around specific components, you can sort of reduce the part of the screen that disappears while the loading state is on for a specific component. So let me load another album, and you will see that the photos disappears in this case, and the loading photos is shown until the data is retrieved from the server. Now similarly, if I click on a different user, then you note that that will require you to load a new set of albums for that specific user. So that's why the albums as well as the photos disappear. And then once the set of albums are fetched, then the album list is displayed here, and then clicking on a particular album will then fetch the photos of that particular album. So this sort of illustrates to you how we can define the suspense boundaries around different components and then make use of suspense in order to display loading states within our screen. So as I illustrated to you in this example, suspense is still a work in progress, and so you shouldn't be using it in production applications. But I just wanted to show you how you can reduce the amount of boilerplate code that you need to use within your components just in order to display loading states. The use of suspense component, as we have seen there, allows you to display the loading state of your components. But also, as I mentioned, this requires that your data fetching libraries need to have suspense integration. And so when the ecosystem develops, then it'll be the right time for you to make use of suspense within your React applications.